I'm such a bore, I'm such a bummer. There must be more behind the summer. I want someone to make some trouble. Been way too safe inside my bubble. Take me out and keep me up all night. Let me live on the wilder side of the light. Carry me away, carry me away, carry me away. Carry me away, carry me away, carry me away. You carnival, you loose cannon. Can I have some more? I can't understand it. You fast car, you foolish spender. You know you are, and I surrender. So come on over and wake me up. Put some of your tequila in my coffee cup. You know I need you, and that's for sure. You're just the kind of crazy I've been carrying away. Carry me away, carry me away. When the sun makes my face all different. Carry me away, carry me away, carry me away. I can fake it and pretend I don't wanna see your face again. And I can find me someone new, but all I want is to be with you. I can learn how to let you go and carry on with the one-man show. I'll fade away into the blue, but all I want is to be with you. All I want is to be with you. I'll get dressed and hit the town tonight. Meet some faces under neon lights. I'll dance along with deja vu, but all I want is to be with you. All I want is to be with you. wanna use me, then you gotta use me till I'm gone. I'm not a fallen angel, I just fell behind. I'm out of luck and I'm out of time. If you don't wanna love me, let me go. I'm running for the last train. I'm running for the last train home. If you wanna know me, then you gotta know me through and through. And if you're gonna hurt me, then you gotta hold me next to you. No matter how you work it, things go wrong. I put my heart where it don't belong. So if you're coming with me, let me know. Maybe you're the last train. Maybe you're the last train home. I'm on the last train running. I'm on the last train running. And I surrender. And I surrender. I'm on the last train running. I'm on the last train running. And I surrender. And I surrender. I'm on the last train running. I'm on the last train running. And I surrender. And I surrender. I'm on the last train running. I'm on the last train running. And I surrender. I surrender. Should have been open, should have done more.
Okay, the hall is coming to a natural hush, which I think means it's ready, time for us to get going. So hello everyone, I'm Scott McPherson. I'm the Director General for Strategy, Policy and Programmes in UKHSA, and I am hosting this final session, which you'll be delighted to know has a panel of experts who are much more expert on the topic than I am. My job is to manage the discussion. So our final session of the day is on how we can work better together to protect public health in a post-pandemic world. We may have a bit of a discussion of whether we are, in fact, already in a post-pandemic world or not. So I'm going to start by introducing the panel, and then I'm going to do a couple of things before we get into the discussion. So just from the far end, we have Debs Harkins, who is the Director of Public Health, not very far away in Calderdale. We then have Kevin Fenton, who is both the London Regional Director and the President of the Faculty of Public Health. Will Welfare is the Director of Regions in UKHSA. We've then got Jennifer Dixon, who is the Chief Exec of the Health Foundation, and hopefully you will still recognise Jenny from this morning. Jenny Harries, who is obviously the Chief Exec of UKHSA. The way we're going to run the session is each of the panel members is going to speak for about 5 minutes, and then we will open it up for discussion, questions from the floor, which we'll put to the panel and give them all an opportunity to have a discussion. And hopefully it can be quite an interactive discussion. But before we start that, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the day. I've certainly found it a fantastic day, loads of really excellent presentations on an incredible variety of topics. And I've also felt there's been a real buzz in the room, and as people are walking around connecting with, in some cases, old friends, people you haven't seen for a while, in some cases making some new connections, which is one of the real benefits of us being here together rather than just online. And if you haven't seen it, do go to the exhibition hall and have a visit to some of the stands there. A really great set of things to see and people to chat to in between sessions while you're maybe having a cup of coffee, a chance to meet some other people as well. Other thing I did want to touch on is really conscious that it's been quite difficult walking between here and the other building. So we've obviously had a group of very noisy protesters outside. It's a public space. They have a right to protest, but I certainly felt some of it was getting quite aggressive and confrontational with people shouting at us as we've been walking from one place to another. You'll have spotted that they've now left for the day, which I have to say I was quite relieved by. Now, there's a chance they'll be back tomorrow. We don't have any specific intelligence from the police or others about whether they will, but I think it's quite likely, and we should assume they may be back tomorrow. Encouragement for tomorrow is do exactly what we've been doing today. I have to say everybody in this room has been incredibly polite and really not interacting with the protesters, even if they're shouting abuse at us, and we should do the same tomorrow. We have been in contact with the local police and the venue security, and they're well aware of the protests and will be keeping a close eye on it tomorrow. I think I did notice a bit of a toning down of some of the shouting during the course of the day after the police spoke to them. So if they're back tomorrow, more of the same. And then the final thing I'd say on that is I certainly noticed they were shouting at things like follow the science and we should be saving lives. And it did strike me that actually people in this room have been following the science. In fact, more than that, we've been developing the science. Genuinely, as various speakers have said during the day, people in this room have saved thousands of lives through the work we've done. So not nice being shouted at, but I think we can feel positive that we've made a massive difference to the population over the last 2 years. So enough for me, and I will now hand over to our first speaker. Thank you. So Debs is going to speak first, and I should say she does need to leave after about half an hour, so she will quietly leave the stage at some point, but we're delighted she's here with us.
Is this working? Yes, yes. I do have a voice that carries, but not that far. There's a lot of you there. So I've been asked to say a little bit about, I guess, my experience as a Director of Public Health, a local Director of Public Health from the pandemic, and some of the lessons that I've learned, and myself and my team have learned, and some of the implications for our work, particularly around inequalities and inequalities in, I guess, in health protection. So I took on my post as Director of Public Health for Calderdale on the 1st of April 2020. So it was early in the first lockdown. So I sort of worked remotely. So on the 31st of March, I was working in Dudley, sitting on my dining room table, and on the 1st of April, I was working on the same dining room table for Calderdale. And the first cases of COVID had arrived earlier in Dudley than in Calderdale. And I felt like I was visiting from the future when I was in Calderdale, probably about 3 weeks in the future. And I think that never stayed away from me, that sort of thinking about where are we now, what have we learned before, not forgetting what's gone before, and thinking about that in thinking about responding. And really, right at the very beginning of the pandemic in Calderdale, we were starting to see a disproportionate impact of COVID on our Black and Asian communities. Kevin was starting some amazing work, but we also we decided that one of the first things we would do would engage with our local Asian communities in Halifax. So we used telephone calls, WhatsApp groups, video conferencing, working with trusted local voluntary organisations, community leaders, to hear their views about the unfair impacts that our Asian communities were experiencing. They were really, really powerful. And this was in April 2020. And that insight stayed with us the whole time and shaped every moment actually of our response, but we also made it the way we work. So we continued to do that sort of listening and engagement with our black and minority ethnic communities, but also as patterns of the pandemic changed over time. So as our different areas of our borough, different types of occupations started to see higher prevalence. It really came into its own, the work, that engagement work, when we had concentrations in cases of COVID in parts of Halifax, in the areas that many of our Asian communities lived in. You know, we had, we were out there engaging, and we set up mechanisms so that we were always listening and understanding what the concerns were at every moment. And I was personally out listening to communities on the day that when I went home, the Secretary of State texted that we were in a local lockdown, and it was Eid the next day. So I was out there chatting to people. They were coming from Luton and Birmingham saying, well, we've come for Eid. And at 10 o'clock that evening, there was a local lockdown that our community in Halifax was subjected to. And while it was really important, the case rates were really, really high, rebuilding the trust with our community following that, we're still doing that now, to be honest. It became apparent really over time that Calderdale was always different from the rest of the country. We were always out of kilter. We were low when everyone else was high. We were high when everyone else was low. That really created a challenge for local leadership, I think, for myself as Director of Public Health, for my team, for our local colleagues in the NHS, and for our councillors who had a really critical role to play in sort of local leadership as well. And I just want to say on that experience, before I move on to lessons, just throughout the whole of the pandemic, we worked incredibly closely with our fantastic colleagues in the Regional Health Protection team, and particularly Mercy and Rebecca felt like part of Team Calderdale. And I'm really pleased that we've carried on working in that way now. So I still think of Rebecca and Mercy as part of Team Calderdale, and I think that's incredibly important that we maintain those relationships. In terms of just some of the lessons, I guess, from my perspective as a Director of Public Health, I think just the power of national, regional and local teams working together to a common aim. There was times at which we were trying to be divided, and our, you know, your predecessor, Public Health England, you know, there was some real divisiveness and blame there, but we were really clear in Calderdale. We couldn't do this on our own. We're really small. We need to work together with our regional colleagues, and we need the support of our national colleagues. And when we got that right, and when that worked, we really, really punched above our weight. So a good example of that for us was local contact tracing, where we had a genuine partnership between our regional, national colleagues and our local communities. We took a very community-centred approach, and we were one of the highest performing contact tracing services in the whole of our region throughout the whole of the pandemic. What we did was, I think, we recognised the sensitivities, we recognised the challenges that each other was facing at different times. And sometimes we stepped back and let our colleagues at, as was PHE, step forward. And sometimes they stepped back and I could step forward and say things in my independent role as a Director of Public Health. And I think that was really, really important. And then the other thing I think I just want to say in terms of a lesson was that we were always out of sync. I've already said that. We were always different. And that was really, really difficult. But what it really brought home to me, I was really clear about my role and my responsibility, and that is to the people of Calderdale. And I understand for other organisations working at other geographies, there are other issues, but I know what was important to me. So again, if I think about the best example I can think about with that was when we had the highest case rates in school-aged children in the country. It was when the Department for Education had changed what the definition of an outbreak was when it applied to school-aged children, and we decided to put in learning from previous waves, to work with schools to suggest they consider taking additional advice. So that basically if there was somebody at home with COVID, that they keep the child away from school for 3 days and then get a lateral flow test, and if they were negative they came back. We got an incredible amount of pressure from the Department for Education for making that decision. It was all about Calderdale. It wasn't showing off, it wasn't trying to be clever, it was just thinking about Calderdale and what we'd learned from previous waves. And again, it was a really good example of where we actually went from having the highest case rate to one of the lowest in that age group, and we had better than average attendance of children at school, because we knew that by doing that we'd keep kids in school, actually, ironically. And I think it's just that remembering that that's what your local DPH colleagues are, that's our job. We're about the people that we serve. So I think that's a really important thing for me. And I'll just finish, because I'm probably going over time, just to say that in terms of the work that we're taking forward around tackling health inequalities, particularly from a health protection perspective, we're really taking some of the lessons. So the lessons we learned around community engagement, we're now applying to our response to the cost of living crisis. We're taking the very, very specific examples. And then just that our fabulous COVID inequalities vaccine programme, which went out to trusted community venues, that's now being rolled out to help us with the recovery of vaccine immunisation following the pandemic. So it's about really taking some of those examples and applying them.
So I'm going to build a lot on what you've said, because I think we have many shared experiences. So colleagues, as you've heard, I started as the Regional Public Health Director for London at the same time as you did, probably a week before, on the 23rd of March. And prior to that, I was one of the executive directors in a local authority in Southwark. So I started the pandemic response in Southwark, then moved to be the Regional Public Health Director. And there's so many lessons over the past 2.5 years. But in London, what we're beginning to think through are no longer the lessons, but the legacies of the pandemic. So what is truly going to change as a result of the experience that we've gone through? What behaviors will be different? What cultures will be new? What ways of working will be locked in, so that when we look back, we can say, as a result of having this severe and shared experience, and in many changes, life-altering experience, we did things completely differently. So I thought I'd reflect on some of the legacies and the legacy conversations that we're having in London. And as the president of the faculty, I've just finished my first 100 days in that role, and I've been holding listening sessions and meeting colleagues across the country. These legacies, this ambition for what needs to be different, are coming across as consistent themes. So there are 5 that I'll quickly reflect on, and we'll have a chance to reflect on them a bit more as I'm sure the conversation progresses. So number 1, the importance of data and evidence and research which not only characterizes the problem, but really helps us to understand where and how do we target our efforts to truly make a difference. And when I think of where we started the pandemic and where we've ended, with the quality of data, with the degree of granularity of the information that we have, where in London, for example, I could tell you which ward in the city at any given point had both high rates of COVID, had low vaccination rates by ethnicity and by age group, and I could send vaccine buses into that ward, working with the Director of Public Health and local authorities, to ensure we reached those communities and worked with local community groups. Now, we've proven with COVID that we can do this. So the question that I think we need to ask ourselves as a legacy of the pandemic is, why don't we have this data for obesity? Why don't we have this data for other infectious diseases? And what would it take to get there? And that's the conversation I think that we need to have as we think about the legacies of the pandemic. It's going to be too easy to fall back to, oh, it was too hard. Oh, we don't have the modelers and the economists anymore working on this. and we need to address it. Number two, we learned a lot about working in an integrated and a stronger partnership way than we had ever done before. Prior to the pandemic, we had lots of ambitions about health and care integration, closer working between public health and clinical practice. We had more conversations about vertical integration. How do we get national, regional to local level working more effectively? The nature of the pandemic and the pandemic response forced us to work more closely together, to put aside petty organizational differences and rivalries, and to focus on what was an existential threat. And that enabled us to do things that we could never have imagined, right? Pooling budgets, sharing data, giving staff and moving staff across systems in ways that we had dreamt about before, and which I think we need to hold on to now as we deal with whether it's monkeypox or preparing for the new autumn and winter waves of COVID and flu. This integrated working across silos has to be part of the legacy as we emerge from the pandemic. Now, in London, one of the tangible ways we're looking at this is how we change from organizations to systems, and looking at systems leadership within the public health family. So whether you're working in local government, in the regional tier or national tier, the leadership and the voice and ambition for public health in the city is done through systems working with our directors of public health and colleagues in the GLA. Across the country, we're seeing new models of public health being delivered and developed, and that's exactly the sort of legacy I think we need arising from the pandemic. Three very more brief points just to land legacies that we're working on. The third is around this new relationship we have with our communities, a new contract that we signed with our communities as a result of going through the pandemic. And what contract is this, you may be asking? It's a contract that we said, listen, we will be honest with you and tell you information. We will work with you to co-produce and co-design interventions. We promise you that our messages will be more culturally competent, and we will use channels that relate to you and engage you in new and purposeful ways. That must be a legacy arising from the pandemic, and I'm hoping that wherever you are and whatever you're doing, that that community-centered approach to tackling not only COVID or flu or monkeypox must be part of a legacy moving forward. Final thing then, I will end on the last two, is just about governance and leadership. We've seen leaders appear from so many sectors, community leaders, community champions, political leaders, leaders within health and care systems who stood up and became part of a wider public health workforce and a wider public health army that helped us to get through the pandemic. I'm keen in my role as the president of the faculty to harness the understanding that we now have as a community about population health, about health inequalities, about what it truly means to be community-centered in our approach, and to hope that actually that will help us with resilience. It will help you, Jenny, with a different model of health security, one that recognizes that actually, although UKHSA may be accountable for it, that you have an army of colleagues working on health protection and health security because of our experience going through the pandemic. Finally, a legacy of the pandemic, and this is the fifth and final one, is just taking care of yourselves. It's been tough, it's been hard, and I know many of us learned a lot about our personal resilience and about organizational resilience. And it would be a real shame if we lost that coming out of the pandemic, and if this isn't a legacy in terms of how we take care of each other, how we support each other, how we train and develop the capacity that we need to do things differently moving forward. So with that, thank you.
So my thoughts and comments could very much build on both Deb's and Kevin. In terms of probably three key points of learning for me, and then a couple on current focus. So in learning, it's been about, from the pandemic, it's been about systems, agility, and communities. And we're very much working in multiple, complex, interdependent, multi-agency, multidisciplinary systems, plural, definitely of systems, that vary across the country because Calderdale is special, Kevin's going to tell me London is special. Each individual system is different, and it's different for a good reason. And as we work with them, we really need to make sure that we are focusing on the outcomes we want, those shared goals. This is not about us all doing it the same way, but it is about trying to achieve those shared goals, those shared aspirations. On agility, I can tell you about the lessons from the pandemic, but actually it's about planning for the future, because it's not going to be quite as we've experienced in the past. So it's actually truly pulling out the lessons and not just repeating the past. That importance of that rapid, evidence-based response and the ability to change it, to move it up and down as the evidence changes. So that agility is going to remain important. And then finally, in terms of learning, it is about the communities. They're very much at the heart of it. It's working with them. And actually throughout this, we've really seen reinforced those wider determinants of health, those inequalities, but also the solutions coming from those communities. So where does that take us at the moment? And this is definitely from UKHSA Region's perspective. There's a lot about concurrency, isn't there? We've spent a lot of the last 2 years focusing on one thing. We now need to focus on multiple different things. And actually is how we take some of the learning, the tools, the infrastructure that we developed in COVID, as well as the things from before that, to create something that we can do across all of those hazards. But then in slight contrast, I don't really think this is about just looking at each individual hazard. This is very much looking at those communities and not going separately talking to communities about hepatitis B, then a separate conversation about TB, a separate one about flu. This is about how we actually try and shift some of our focus from individual hazards to actually working with those communities. And then finally, it's about our people. As Kevin said, it's been a tough couple of years, but the huge resource of the system is in the people that's in it, and that's where our success is going to be. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. My name's Jennifer Dixon, and I'm the Chief Executive, as Scott said, of the Health Foundation. I'm also very proud to be on the advisory board of the UKHSA. As a Chief Executive of the Health Foundation, it's an independent philanthropic organisation doing research on a number of things to do with health and healthcare. And during the pandemic, I was over to one side and watching all of you perform with great skill. So you really do have my utmost respect with how you've all given and gone above and beyond to deal with the pandemic in the most impressive way. So I was very pleased to join the board. So my comments are over to one side a bit because, as I said, I was in the quiet climes of a philanthropic organisation, nevertheless one doing research and analysis on inequalities and the pandemic, and also looking at policy too. So just a few words on that from my perspective. So I think just standing back from the pandemic, we all know that life expectancy is increasing, but it's increasing more slowly in Britain than it has since before 2011. Over that last 10 years or so, most countries' life expectancy has stalled. Nobody really knows why. There's multiple reasons. It's a worldwide phenomenon, but it's been worse in the UK and Iceland, oddly, in the US as well. Many factors: austerity, smoking, other risk factors that we know about, poverty, inequalities in wealth, and so on. we know have been growing, and those have been documented in the Marmot Review, which you will know, and the Health Foundation was proud to fund the 10-year review, revisiting of Marmot. And as we know, underlying health frayed in the UK, particularly in certain areas, poorer areas, the northeast, particularly in women in poorer communities, and that really left people much more vulnerable to the pandemic when it did arrive. Sprinkle COVID on that kind of fabric, and we see what's happened. So that's the kind of background history. I think the pandemic not only showed up those inequalities that were seared on our consciousness, but they also did a few other things as well. I think one is they also, what flared up was skepticism about the role of science, and Scott did refer to the people outside. If you go down Whitehall these days, you see a big placard saying Chris Whitty is a mass murderer. Poor Chris. So that is something that if we're interested in resilience, we can't ignore at the UK Health Security Agency. And also, I think what also happened in the pandemic, there was a sort of increasing of public consciousness about inequality. And it was also, I think, George Floyd, was in the mix too. And if you look at polls these days, Ipsos recent polling, you see a much greater interest among the UK population on social justice issues. So a lot of that is in the air. In the pandemic, and actually now particularly, I think, there's also been increased interest in health and wealth and the link between those two, which became obvious. And I think that's particularly recently shown with the amount of people who are economically inactive now. And the biggest reason is due to ill health. And of course, the cost of living crisis will add all to that. So I think there's huge interest in health in a way that there wasn't before, and greater interest in inequality, in which UKHSA is performing all of its work. So it's all very well sort of blathering on about that. What do you do about it? So just a few words on policy. Clearly, a lot of these factors that are fraying our health are to do with the wider determinants of health, as have been mentioned, and they're way beyond what public health and indeed the UKHSA can influence. The government has said, this is before the current government, the Johnson government, has committed to increasing healthy life expectancy by 5 years by 2035, and also to reduce inequalities in health. We know OHID was formed to put together a white paper on disparities. That's stalled at the moment. And this agency also has a remit not just to show leadership and action in health security, but also to try to act on inequalities as well as part of that remit in its mandate letter. So I think in terms of collaboration, which is the theme of this panel, I think that if we really want to build health resilience, then clearly a lot of that action has to be on the wider determinants, which is out with the central primary mission of UKHSA. But UKHSA, I think, can show leadership with partners to do this and can get this engine on the road. OHID clearly is committed to a cross-government strategy, because obviously it's wider than Department of Health. It requires cross-government action, but it also requires action, as Kevin says, in local government, across businesses that are now interested in this agenda. I sit on the CBI's Health Council, and it is amazing to me how many large businesses are very keen on trying to improve health. Again, seize the day is their mantra, having been galvanized by the pandemic. And also, I'm also on a group of investors that sit on £2 trillion worth of investment money, which is about the size of the UK economy, by the way, to try to influence the businesses and companies that they invest in to try and improve health. A bit like the green agenda, it's part of ESG. So all of this is in the mix. What we've said at the Health Foundation, there absolutely needs to be cross-government strategy to deal with health and think of health as a long-term asset. Forget about short-term things that how we normally live from hand to mouth in policy. This is a long-term asset like natural capital, which is the green agenda, and we really need a 10, 20-year program to address this and build resilience. And we've actually called for an independent report to Parliament, akin to the UK Climate Change Committee on health, to report on progress and the results and impact of a longer-term strategy. Also, of course, backed with investment. We know that public health itself has been cut. in real terms by 25% per person since 2015. So all of this is part of a bigger agenda in which UK Health Security Agency sits. So the main message from me, I think, is there is a huge national role here to be played by UKHSA, along with its close colleagues, OHID and the NHS in particular, to build on this agenda and to use every influence it can at that level. But also, I've been on the board of several other public agencies in my time, 2 of which were disbanded, I have to say. I don't want to spoil the party here. I'm sure you're not going to be disbanded. But one of the issues that we had to fight against in those public agencies was mission creep. And the most important thing is to stick to the knitting. Sorry, I shouldn't say this, Jenny, because you know all this. But is to really focus on what you're meant to be here for, which is, of course, acting on threats. Wider determinants are slightly out with your remit, but it's clearly relevant. So the question is to show and do the business with the health security, but at the same time, do not lose any opportunity to show leadership on the wider agenda. And I think what's going to be absolutely critical in these early days and in these very turbulent political times when no one has a budget, no one knows what government policy is, quite frankly, is to have strategic clarity amongst yourselves and also with your close compatriots, OHD, OHID, and the NHS, on what sticking to the knitting is, but then what you can show leadership in collaboration with others to further a longer-term agenda on health. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. One of the problems with being on a 5-chair panel with very erudite colleagues, you're right, is by the time it gets to this chair, it's quite difficult to have something new. It's like the party game. And I was just trying to think what size of garment we are currently knitting in UKHSA, because we do actually have a lot of interest. So I hope I was quite sort of organised in my thinking this morning when I spoke. I've now got a sort of CEO smorgasbord of comments to make. So I'm just going to run through them, possibly not in any logical order. So the first one, just picking up something Kevin said, I think we have to forget and focus in everything that we do. Forget the organisational boundaries, forget who's got the budget. Because what we've seen in the pandemic is if everybody is really focused on delivering some public health outcome, obviously for UKHSA, as Jennifer said, it will be a health threat, a health protection outcome. That automatically unites us. It gets rid of all the other problems, and it gives a great sense of satisfaction as well as producing health outcomes to individuals. So that's really important. I think, just to add to flag so that everybody's very clear, the pandemic is not over. Scott, I thought I'd just drop that one in. So we still have lots of work to do. And I think there are some things, quite tangible things that we can learn actually from the pandemic. So people have mentioned data. One of the things which is really interesting, we tend to focus on the data that comes out. So data quality, really important. Kevin spoke about being clear what the impact was on his community, in particular at granular level. But actually, the research going in to show what the evidence base is often quite imperfect. Now, some of that is understandable. So, for example, and we've seen it with this pandemic, effects of vaccine and safety of vaccine in pregnant women, for example, what has changed because it's not something we would normally recommend at the start unless there was a clear mortality signal, which CMO referred to. But it is information that you acquire as you go through. But actually, we often don't proactively take the steps to get the right action. And in the UK, particularly generally, evidence on for children is not well done. And there's a push around research. There's often perfectly ethical ways of doing that if we think of children right at the start. But equally, even for women, there's a lot of bias in the research which is out there, and when we come to ethnicity, we don't usually have the right levels of data. So I think thinking about the evidence base that we're starting on in health protection, and then how we can use that and identify what gaps there are right at the start of a health protection response is really important. I think also we are quite rightly focused here, I think, on UK populations, but we do need to understand, both because of travel risks as well, about for different diaspora in different parts of the country, but equally about the risks to all of our populations from inequalities in countries overseas. So actually having good surveillance, both at home and internationally, is something which is really important for all of us, for those populations and for ours. And we just need to continuously think of that not as two separate blocks, but as something which is overlapping. Then a couple of other points I just mentioned, I think. One of the points I think Will raised was around change. So I sometimes call it temporality or flexibility. But if we think back to the pandemic, we've seen in a number of areas that things change over time. And I'm not sure that our politicians, the public, quite expected that. So, for example, we had very different minority ethnic attack rates for COVID, depending initially on the geography. But the translation of that in the early part of the pandemic was really important, not least because we have extremely worried populations who feel that they are at increased risk. And we know that even when we're doing good scientific work and we look at the first 100 cases, we're looking to see what the characteristics of a previously unknown pathogen are, we can get extremely biased results from those first cases. So I think while we're perhaps not dealing quite with the detail of a new pathogen, we have a responsibility to try and translate that message out. So when we get variations at the start of an outbreak, in the future, whatever it might be, people understand that those early phases, that early data and interpretation may well change, and it's really important to continuously look at very robust data. I think there are a couple of opportunities I wanted to flag as well. One is, I was very much involved with the shielding programme at the start. Now, that was a very sensible, logical approach in the face of a completely unknown pathogen. But we do know that for some people, actually many who decided themselves that they were wanting to shield rather than that it was a clinically suggested approach, that has been quite detrimental. So what we actually need to do as we go forward, and I think we can do now, is remove our initial clunky mechanism of trying to, our first attempts really at connecting data across a system and trying to identify those individuals who particularly need additional clinical support going through and particularly need to be kept informed of developments. And actually make that better. So now what we have is an enhanced protection programme with link up with the NHS, with the antiviral task force, and with the, well now the COVID vaccine unit, was previously the vaccine task force, to make sure that we are continuously identifying those individuals and that they have access to testing to bring them into potential care systems very early. I think that can be refined for the future so that should we get disease X or a similar pattern again, we can call on that very rapidly. And then another one, which I think is my only one that nobody mentioned at all particularly, although there was a mention, was occupational health. I think this is an era for occupational health to come into its own. Jennifer mentioned it in relation to health and well-being, but actually what we saw in the pandemic was different risks for transmission in different types of occupational settings. And it seems to me there is a lot of work that we can do to understand that better going forward and better protect those workforces and make them aware. So I think I'm going to pause at that point because I think we're going out to the audience and they always ask much more interesting questions and put us on the spot.
Okay, that was 5 fantastic presentations. It all picked up some quite different themes as we went through the presentations. I'll pick out a couple of things that I thought were quite consistent. So one was working across boundaries. So UKHSA working in partnership with other agencies nationally, locally, and regionally, I think really important. I think there was a common theme about the need to engage with communities, both in the way that we're actually engaging diverse populations, but also how we think about the underlying inequalities. And then I thought there was also something else I wanted to pick out, which I was very struck by Debs and Kevin both saying they started new jobs right at the beginning of the pandemic. And I suspect lots of people in this room started new jobs or changed jobs. And I also suspect lots of people in this room worked incredibly long hours and at weekends and under enormous stress and pressure when we were also worried about our own friends and family. So I think the point about looking after ourselves and our colleagues is really crucial and probably something we don't talk about enough. But anyway, so some great presentations from the panel. There's also enormous expertise in the room. So I'm really keen to get questions, comments, challenge from all of you. So if you've got something point you want to make, raise a hand and we will send you a roving mic to you. There's one right at the front here, and I shall try my best to look at the back as well. Any more hands? There's one in the middle here. Yeah. So let's go to the front. Let's take these two questions and then we'll go to the panel.
Thanks. I really enjoyed talks, really fascinating. But just picking up on Chris Whitty's point that we've known about, and there have been lots of epidemics and we know a lot about the past, I'd like to channel my colleague Martin Reagan, who isn't here today, and what he would ask you is, what did we not learn from previous epidemics that we could learn better about how we use history from what's happened in the last 2.5 years?
Fantastic. Let's take this question.
Thank you.
Sorry, I should have said it'd be great if people could introduce yourselves before you ask questions. Sorry, over to you.
Thank you very much. My name is Mpanga from Zambia. So interesting legacy indeed, and I just wanted to make a follow-up on the new relationship with the community that we've developed or we've actually established. If you could have any reflections or thoughts on how we can sustain this. I know one way is probably in terms of our honest communication with the communities. I think one of the lessons we didn't learn from previous pandemics or outbreaks, I think we kept the data to ourselves so much. But I think this time around, the data was all over even on the internet. Anyone would know how many cases we have and on a daily basis. But I think just reflecting on this, how can we sustain this new contract that we have with the community? Thank you.
I might turn to Kevin first on that, because you mentioned the phrase of a new contract with communities.
Yeah, so thank you. I think that's such a great question, and actually that would be my response to Jackie's question in terms of, we always knew this, that the success in managing any pandemic or epidemic ultimately involves engaging people and meeting people where they're at. We learned this from 40 years of the HIV pandemic, and the mobilization and the engagement of communities globally have been essential in helping us to get to the end of the HIV pandemic. And the fact that we can even be thinking now about ending HIV transmission by 2030 is a testament only to the partnership between scientists, clinicians, communities, and politicians to get us to this point. So your question is, how do we hold on to this lesson again, now that it's been given to us once again? I think there are three things, very quickly. Number one, ensuring that we fulfill the promises that we've made to our communities, whether it is around the ways in which we engage them in decision-making about their health, the way we engage them with research about what is important to them, and the ways in which we develop our public health programs, ensuring that the community's voice, they're on our advisory boards, they're part of co-creating and co-producing interventions. I think that's going to be key. Number two, ensuring that we're more transparent with our communities in, as you said, data, the evidence. Trust has taken a hit as we've gone through the pandemic. And I think a key part of the trust and rebuilding that is truth, transparency, and consistency. And so I'd love to see more of that in our relationship with our local communities. And finally, one of the things I heard, we did so many town hall events across the region through the pandemic. And the most common theme that came back to us was, don't forget us when the pandemic is over. Don't forget us when we've taken the vaccine and we're dealing with hypertension, obesity, diabetes, mental health issues in our communities. Now that we've gotten the vaccine, don't forget us. So I think my third point is around consistency and keeping up and building those relationships because we value them.
Fantastic. Who wants to have a go at what didn't we learn from previous epidemics that we should have done? Jenny?
Right. Can you hear me? Yes. I'm trying a new microphone with yellow sticky tape this time. So what didn't we learn? I was trying to think through this because I think Kevin was talking about HIV then and a success story, but something which I think we could have tackled earlier. CMO this morning was referring, I think, to respiratory pandemics. His flu slide is a really important one, I think. And that's the one which I suspect Martin may be referring to and thinking about because I think it is much more difficult to do. The reality is that I think we probably now know that almost every community will get affected, will have been affected. Even trying to slow things down, there are good rationales for trying to slow things down to protect people for individual periods of time until you can get vaccines into the population. But there is an inevitability about the transmission of a pandemic respiratory flu or something similar. So the question is, what are the actions in those circumstances that we could take? And I don't think there are single ones. There are a few in this one which I think scientifically we perhaps could have paid more attention to. One of them is about asymptomatic and pre-symptomatic transmission. So this is getting into the technical realm rather than the sort of community people realm. But I think at each stage in the pandemic, we have to think through what are the possibilities. Now, I know personally that these issues were thought through. It's not that they were forgotten. So we went down the list of things that needed to be thought about. But there is a real risk when you're in that situation that perhaps we don't think because you can't see it. So asymptomatic transmission is really difficult to measure until you're well into a pandemic. So these sorts of things I think we need to be really open-minded about. That's one thing. And perhaps thinking the worst is a good place to start in many ways because it will keep your mind open. I think just the most obvious one, which has come from this conversation and actually the way we work, we have all said about maintaining, and I tried to promote it really strongly this morning, we have to maintain these relationships, these structures, these levels of trust, these channels of communication, the interdisciplinary work all the time. It's absolutely no good expecting to suddenly stand them up in the pandemic. And when we do exercises, which we do regularly, we do tabletop exercises, we involve different parts of the system, we go up and down, we involve politicians, we go across, we look into the detail. But actually they have to be really real. They have to be based on existing relationships that we maintain constantly. And I think that is probably, for me, the key message.
Okay, let's go back to the floor and more hands for more questions. There's a couple in the middle there, close to each other. We can go to those two. And Bob, if you go, maybe there's a couple right at the back left. So let's take a pair of questions from the middle, and then we'll take a pair from the back, and then that will be our final round of discussion. So
my name's Emily. I'm a local authority public health consultant. My question is about, I guess, future workforce planning. So from a local authority perspective, we did kind of a lot of, I guess, mutual aid for UKHSA and PHE previously around outbreak management, and we had lots and lots of non-specialist, non-public health staff redeployed from other parts of local authority and other organisations. It would be good to know what the thinking is in terms of how that would be done next time, because the reality is in the next pandemic, potentially the same thing will happen again. So we've done lots of thinking at local level, but it would be really good to hear what thinking has been done at national level.
Okay, and if you could pass the microphone to the person I think was in the same row this way. Yep. Thank you.
Yeah, so I'm Ashley Otter. I work at Porton Down. My question is just, it's all about the maintaining the relationships. How do we translate this to central government to keep us carrying on funding these kind of relationships and the benefits of these relationships in kind of the wake of the pandemic? Like, take the ONS or Siren study. I think maintaining these going forward will be kind of essential for not just COVID, but many other pathogens as well. So it'd be good to know how we translate that to government and ministers and politicians for funding.
Okay, and particularly to make sure we keep the funding, is that the point?
Yeah. But also, yeah, maintaining these relationships, like Jenny said, is kind of, I think, essential.
Okay, thank you. And then let's take the 2 questions from the back.
Hi, I'm Lou Tunnicliffe. I'm part of the strategy and policy team within the COVID vaccine unit. In government, we often categorise work in terms of the urgent and the important. For the last 2 years, COVID has been monopolising both of those, being urgent and important. As we get to what feels like the back end of the pandemic and other urgent scenarios in government sort of monopolise things like the war in Ukraine, the energy crisis, the cost of living, how do we make sure that both in terms of government financially and in the minds of ministers, this important work continues to be at the top of priorities, but also linking back to that sort of social behavioural aspects and our relationship with the public and other bodies, that we keep that in the forefront of people's minds.
Okay, and then there's another question from the same area.
Hi, I'm Melissa. My question is about partnership working, but on a macro level. We've been working on, I've been helping on the health equity strategy, and one thing that's come out for me is about ownership. And I guess I was thinking about the first few months of the pandemic and everyone standing on the stage, and professionals were asking the population to kind of trust and to go into lockdown and to do various things. And as a result, people became armchair professionals. And I guess the question is, how do you keep that interest and that level of engagement and education kind of going two-way now that the pandemic's finished and those messages aren't being received on a nightly basis?
Fantastic. So 4 quite different questions. So I shall let you see how you can answer as we go. Shall we start from this end and go along? Jenny.
Thank you. On all 4, that's quite a challenge. So I'll whiz through and make a couple of points on each one, and then we can pass on. So I've got the first one I wrote down reserve for, so I'm not sure that's quite the right question. But in UKHSA, actually, and Will might want to pick up on this, we are actually looking at, we also have downsized a lot of staff, and I might add, particularly on the test and trace side, and in the time that they had spent with us, have become really passionate public health advocates. And I think the same has been the case in local authorities. There have been brilliant staff working through the pandemic who are really switched into how we can support not just health protection, but public health more widely. So we are looking at whether we have a public health rapid support team, which we send out overseas, but we don't actually have one that we send out locally. And so I think there's an opportunity for us in practical terms to keep hold of names, people that we can draw and call upon who we know would be interested. There may be opportunities to, I think, in many workforces actually have people who are interested, who have a day job, but actually they might want to turn towards this, and for us to be aware. And then I think there is a further opportunity that we can explore internally that says actually, particularly for local authorities where I know your workforces are diminishing, in the new world, obviously not at pandemic levels, but that there may be some sort of UK equivalent to that rapid support team to send out and support. I realise I'm going to have to speed up if I'm saying on each one.
I was just about to rudely interrupt my boss.
Can I just do the one on so there was a question about funding and relationships, and I just want to draw a distinction because I think it's within all of us to retain relationships in all of the jobs that we do. And if we start saying we can only do it if we've got funding, we'll fail in both our humanity, if you like, but also in our wider public health remit. So notwithstanding that, I think the questions you raised, the brilliant studies, Siren and Vivaldi, which have given us great information through the pandemic, we do need to look at those and say, do we need those for this particular pathogen going forward? What is it we recommend? And if there's a clear public health recommendation and rationale, then we should make that very strongly. If not, we might actually want to say there's a certain time period during the pandemic when we need particular types of studies and have those ready, answering Martin's question, on the shelf to go for the next pandemic. I'll pass on at that point, Jennifer.
Thank you. There's a clutch of questions where there is a theme about what, in keeping interest amongst the government, maybe to secure, maintain funding and so on, once the emergency threat has gone. Well, I think all people who've studied public policy for any period will know that short-termism is absolutely endemic in democracies. That's the way they go on. That's the way we go on. And you know, risk is the risk in front of you and not the risk that could be in the future. With probably one exception, or two exceptions. One is the green agenda, where the risk is in the future, in this country at least. And the second is in the Infrastructure Commission, where you're actually not looking at risk, but you're looking at opportunities, because you can't think as a government just in 5-year chunks when you're thinking about major infrastructure. So I think that's why I think it's important that we all of us try and change the conversation that health is a long-term asset. It is a capital, like green capital, like financial capital, like other forms of human capital, and that it requires a long-term agenda and it's linked to the future prosperity. So I do think the evidence to show that will unlock interest. And then public policy makers understand that there are certain what's called commitment devices that can try to bind governments for more than their term of office into the future, into 10 years or even 15 years, legal and other devices. Nothing is fail-safe, but some countries have got more devices than others, and I think New Zealand has tried to move very actively on that. So I think that is probably a higher level sort of response to the need to keep some health and the health threats current. And then the other lever I think that we could use, just very quickly, is to not take the mitigating risk approach, a long-term approach, but to say how important it is for future opportunity grabbing through growth, because health equals wealth. So I think to turn all of this from an emergency short-term issue to a long-term asset that we need to plan and invest in is the way forwards. Thanks.
Fantastic. So we're running out of time, so quick final thoughts.
Very rapidly on some of the future workforce planning, just to pick up on that. It's very tempting just to jump straight to talk about the specialist workforce, but I really think it's important that we actually build on our empowered, knowledgeable communities and use that. We actually empower our staff in a range of sectors. So I think social care is a good example. We've now got some really expert social care staff at managing respiratory outbreaks. How do we keep on building on that? Because that's going to be key to any response, whether it's seasonal or whether it's pandemic. And then all of our assets, whether that's looking at contact centres, looking at our specialist teams, wider teams, making sure we've got those reserve arrangements, and then really thinking about the future. Who do we think we'll need in all of these, and making sure the plan is through there. The only other point I was going to pick up was on the relationships, and just that actually a lot of the response has been very focused and has been enabled by individual relationships. Is the true interpersonal relationships have been critical on that, and they don't require a huge amount of funding. So it's actually how we actually maintain and keep those, recognising that there is a requirement to actually provide the structure to allow those to flourish, clear roles and responsibilities, and an adequate level of resourcing.
Great. So I think for my final comment, I'm going to put my presidency hat on the Faculty of Public Health, and I'm going to reflect on the workforce planning question, because I think it's a great question. Coming out of the pandemic, what will our legacy be on not only this current generation of workers, but the future generation of the public health workforce? And how do we engage a wider cross-section of colleagues in this journey with us? Now, that is exactly the mission of the Faculty of Public Health. We want to be helping to grow specialist training for public health. We want to create partnerships with other professions which are allied to public health. So whether you're working in high containment laboratories, you're doing microbiology, you're doing community-facing work, if you are engaged in improving the population's health, you need to be part of the public health family as well. And we want to welcome you to the faculty, and there are different routes and memberships that we can have to create this community. I also think we need to think beyond, as you say, the specialist training for public health. The faculty is building strategic partnerships with behavioral scientists, with population health experts working in the NHS, working with our environmental health officers. There are many other professions that we will continue to build our relationships with. And I think that's going to be a key part of planning holistically for the public health workforce. And my final comment is to the question on partnerships and how do we maintain them. You know, one of the things I've always said to my team is, when we know better, we must do better. And I think the experience of the pandemic has taught us so much more. So although we may be worried about losing some of the lessons and the legacies of the pandemic, we now know better, and I trust that we will do better. We will hold ourselves to account to do that partnership work, to speaking honestly and openly, and we'll help to hold each other to account so we truly lock these lessons in.
Fantastic. What a brilliant point to end. So, I mean, if I reflect on the past couple of years through the pandemic, it's just been an enormous scale of response. So, I don't know whether people are familiar with these figures, but we've distributed about 2 billion lateral flow tests, 2 billion. About 100 million PCR tests have been done, 130 million vaccination doses have been delivered. We've uploaded 2 million genomes onto the GizAid website. And about 40 million cases and contacts have been traced. So enormous scale of response, enormous changes in public behaviour and doing people I couldn't imagined a few years ago that I'd be wearing a mask or doing self-testing at home or changing my behaviour in the way I have, and that's been seen across the population. So incredible scale and behavioural changes, but also, as the panel have illustrated, an amazing opportunity to retain the lessons and the legacies from that and to do things differently in the future. Okay, so that's the end of our last formal session for the day. We started with the morning with Jenny talking about lots of firsts. We've reached a last, which is our last plenary session. But just as when you go to a concert to see your favourite band, there's an encore where they play one of your favourite songs, we have a bonus session coming up, which is the launch of the Centre for Climate and Health in this room. So encourage lots of people to stay for that because it's going to be really interesting. If you are leaving, can I ask you to leave quickly so we can get on to the next session? Thank you very much. And a round of applause for our panel.